Well, first of all, just to again extend our huge thanks to you for doing this, and I'd love to start at the very beginning actually, and ask you a bit about when you first got interested in issues of climate and issues of sustainability. You know, what was it that triggered that first interest?
When did I become aware of climate? I'm actually not a trained natural scientist at all. I am a trained social scientist. I'm an anthropologist. Did both my undergrad and my graduate degrees in anthropology because I was fascinated by change, and I wanted to understand how does social change occur, and that's why I studied anthropology. But and was an active anthropologist for the first few years of my professional life. But then the following happened. I, as a very young child, having been born into a political family, accompanied my parents on their political campaigns to every single corner of this beautiful country. And one corner that they took me to was to a national park called Monteverde, where we had an endemic little golden toad that was not only endemic to Monteverde, but it was the only habitat in the world in which the species was present. And I saw this little golden toad, and I must have been, I don't know, maybe 11 or 12. And that marked my love for nature. I just thought, I have never seen a more gorgeous thing, living being in my life. And I just totally fell in love with nature. And then my love of nature, was wonderfully fertilized through the fact that I'm Costa Rican and we have so much nature surrounding us and so much biodiversity. And I feel incredibly privileged to have been born in this beautiful country. But then when I became a young mother, I thought it was my responsibility to instill in my daughters the same love of nature. And I wanted to take them back to Monteverde during the season of mating of these golden toads, and they were gone. Wow. They were gone. So it's not that the individuals were gone. No, the entire species had gone extinct. And I was appalled. I was absolutely appalled. And I began to ask the scientists, because Monteverde has a lot of scientists, there's a lot of research that is going on there. And I said, what on earth, what happened? And this was 1989, in which the last individuals of that species were seen. My daughters were born in 1988 and 1989. And they said, well, we actually don't know yet, but we think that there is a rise in the temperature of the surface of the forest, and that rise in temperature caused a fungal disease on the skin of these amphibians. And as you can imagine, these amphibians have a very, very sensitive skin, and that disease killed the species. And I thought, how on earth is that happening? And furthermore, I thought, if I, in my 35 years, because I was 35 years old at the time, have actually witnessed the disappearance of one species in my lifetime in this tiny little country, that must mean that many species are disappearing without me personally witnessing it across the planet. And I was just panicked, because I thought, as a mother, there is no way that I am standing up to my responsibility as a mother if what I am giving my daughters is a diminished planet. The whole purpose of parenthood is actually to provide better conditions for our children, not worse conditions. And it was just like, a 4x4 hit me, and I went like, I cannot stand by. I absolutely cannot stand by, because it wasn't just about my two tiny little daughters, right? It's the generations that come after us. And so my realization that even at 35, I already was the ancestor to future generations, and that I have a legacy that I will leave, and that I need to be mindful of that legacy. That was like the huge realization that I had. And so I started studying myself into figuring out what on earth is happening. And before I knew it, I found myself in the basement of the UN building in New York, before COP1 of climate change, and working on behalf of my country to figure out how do we design a COP process that is going to implement what already had been accepted and adopted by all countries in 1992 at Rio de Janeiro, which was the Framework Convention. But the Framework Convention is sort of a goodwill statement. It has no teeth, and it actually needed teeth. And that's what the COP process is. And so there I was in the midst of climate change because of a little golden toad.
Brilliant story. I love that. Could we go to 2015 and the Paris Agreement, Christiana? Because obviously a landmark agreement for the planet in every sense, and you as one of the key prime movers in getting that agreement in place. And I'd love your take, after the fact, a few years on, about how that happened, how that was achieved, and were there moments when you thought it wouldn't be achieved and an agreement wouldn't be reached and you'd walk away from the table with nothing to show?
It was possible for many, many different reasons, right? As usual, I mean, any huge human achievement always has many factors of success and many parents of success. But what were the key factors? I would say one factor of success is that already in 2015, and we've seen it even more since then, but already in 2015, we were already seeing that the technologies that contribute to the solution, renewable energies and electrification of vehicles, et cetera, were already coming down in price, increasing their efficiency and increasing their competitiveness in the market. If we didn't have the technologies that can respond to this challenge, we wouldn't be able to do it. So the fact that we could already begin to see on the horizon that technologies were rapidly being developed that could help to answer or to bolster decarbonization of the global economy was incredibly helpful. So first, good news on the technology. Secondly, geopolitics, very important. There, we had a President Obama in his second term, and hence much more willing to risk some of his political cards on climate change, which he wasn't able to do in his first term, as you will remember. But in his second term, he was, because he understands what this is. He doesn't have to be taught by anybody. He totally knows. And he was given the political space to really stand up to his understandings in his second term. Had 2015 been in his first term, we wouldn't have had the United States on board. And so, thank you, universe, that we had the second term. And still in geopolitics, a Chinese government that had also understood that decarbonizing their production lines is actually the new competitiveness edge of China. They had just understood that, and they were therefore willing to stretch very, very helpful embrace across between the United States and China. And I believe that they signed four bilateral agreements on climate change cooperation before even getting to Paris. So already you have the two highest emitters, the two largest economies already working hand in hand. So geopolitics, thank you very much. You see, the universe conspired, right? The universe conspired to get us technology on the move, geopolitics as we would want it. We also had the rise of, I would say, subnational governments, especially cities, but also states and provinces, as political players that they weren't as much before, because they saw that that their citizens needed the protection and the benefit of decarbonizing the economy. And so we had a very interesting rise in the political presence of city governments, of regional governments, of state governments that were very, very helpful, because sometimes, in fact, quite often, those governments could take a much higher, a much more ambitious position than their national government for many different reasons. And so all of those factors, and of course, the factor of science, right? Every year, climate science gets more detailed, more certain. There's more attribution to extreme events. So while that has improved since 2015, by 2014, we already had enough, in fact, pellucidly clear argumentations from science of what climate change was doing to humanity and to all other living beings on this planet. And so all of that conspired to provide what I would call an enabling context. Now, within that enabling context, we had the challenge that we were coming out of Copenhagen, if anybody remembers Copenhagen, 2009. The COP in Copenhagen. That was what I call the most successful failure of the United Nations ever. And it was a dramatic failure for many different reasons, but universally recognized as a total multilateral failure of politics and of diplomacy, but very successful in the sense that as I assumed the leadership in 2010, 6 months after the Copenhagen failure, we were able to do an in-depth analysis of what had gone wrong in Copenhagen, and that became our Bible. So for several years, we really looked at everything that had gone wrong in Copenhagen and said, right, how are we going to correct this? Some things we could correct very quickly, some things it took us several years, but it was incredibly helpful to have written guidelines of how to improve the process. It was, I think, a 300-page report by a third party that was incredibly helpful to have. There's never, a more valuable lesson than having failed at something. And so we had a Bible of lessons that we could use to design the improvements of the entire process. But on top of that, Andy, sorry to give you such a long answer to this. On top of that, just from a mindset point of view, I am a survivor of Copenhagen, as are many of my colleagues. I was there, and I was traumatized by the experience, as was everybody else who was there. And collectively, the global mood on climate in December and January, December of 2009, January of 2010, and for the rest of that year was disastrous. It was, as I call it, in the trash can, because we had all decided that it was therefore, because we had failed, it was therefore going to be impossible to ever reach a global structure, a global legal agreement that would guide the decarbonization of the global economy for decades to come. And it is factually true that at my very first press conference in June of 2010, some male. I remember it was a male. I wish I could know who it was because I would thank him. But maybe through this article, if you put that in, some journalists will say, it was me. And I will so thank that person. Because the journalist said, Ms. Figueres, do you think that a global agreement is ever going to be possible? And my immediate answer was, not in my lifetime.
Wow. Wow.
Not in my lifetime. And as I said it, Andy, you know how sometimes you say things because they come out of your gut and through your mouth without going through your head?
Yeah.
Well, that was that's what happened. And then when it got to my head, I went, oh my God. Two things were evident to me. Number one, I just gave voice to the global mood on climate change. That is why I said never in my lifetime, because that's what everybody else was thinking. And then secondly, I said, wait a second. So if that were to be true, that means that my commitment to turn over an improved and not a deteriorated planet is a commitment that I have not lived up to. And I went, I am totally going to delete that. I am going to devote my time here at the Secretariat to proving to myself that I was wrong and that a global agreement is possible. And so I injected a lot of time into the Secretariat themselves, the 500 people who work at the Secretariat, because they were in the trash can. They were demoralized, fractured team. It was an absolute, very, very sad situation of an institution. So I devoted a lot of time to re-energize, regenerate that team of brilliant, brilliant people who had devoted and continue to devote their entire life to climate change, but were so demoralized by Copenhagen. And then I think, and then of course, to work with all countries, and I traveled to almost every country to understand what their long-term vision was, what they're thinking about for their own sustainability and prosperity in the future, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then also, I think, quite unusual for a UN institution, I also created something that was called the Groundswell, which was admittedly a secret operation that went beyond the parties, the countries, and beyond the Secretariat. In fact, very few people at the Secretariat knew it was even happening. I hired a very specialized team of people very confidentially, put them all under the direction of Tom Karnak, who's a good friend and colleague and partner now. And I gave them a mandate. I said, we will build a surround sound system that envelops and surrounds all parties and even the Secretariat with a positive message on the possibility of reaching a global agreement. We're going to draw a narrative arc that goes from impossible, which is where we were in 2010, to maybe, to likely, to delivered, possible and delivered. That journey was a 5-year journey. And we're going to do that by motivating certainly the Secretariat as the first concentric circle, the innermost circle. Then the next concentric circle is the parties themselves, the governments to whom I was immediately responsible. And thirdly, this other concentric circle that we created, we invented, of all of these stakeholders. So we reached out to technology providers, to scientists, to religious and spiritual communities, to women's groups, to youth activists, to indigenous leaders, to doctors, to subnational governments, on and on and on, all stakeholders. And we created a surround sound system of encouragement for governments, so that every time that the governments got weak knees, it's like, oh my gosh, we can't do this. Wherever they turned, they got positive reinforcement from all stakeholders that yes, this was going to be possible and that we were going to make it possible collectively. And so honestly, despite, or not despite, but in addition to the factors that I gave you in the beginning, the geopolitics, the technology, et cetera, I actually think that the magical factor there was the shift in the global mindset from impossible to possible, which was a very deliberate, concerted exercise to be able to shift that mindset. Because Andy, you tell me, if you have something to do and you're convinced that you can't do it, you're right. You won't do it. But if you convince yourself that maybe there's a possibility that I can, you're probably also right.
And that's the history of human progress, actually, Christiana.
There you go.
And how beautifully ironic that groundswell were themselves changing the climate of debate in the pursuit of changing the climate. I love that, and I hadn't heard that story at all. It's a great case study in making change happen, actually, especially at the global level. Can I ask you to turn the clock forward now, though, to kind of where we are today? Because I think it's fair to say that the geopolitical stars are not in such not in the same alignment now as then, to put it charitably. And of course, progress against the targets then hasn't been exactly as we would wish either. So, what is your sense of kind of where we are now, both in geopolitical terms and in terms of kind of making good on the commitments that you managed to secure back in 2015?
Yeah, as you say, I think you understate the tragic status of geopolitics now. Just the very difficult relationship just between the United States and China to begin with, or between Russia and the rest of the world, is really of huge concern and is leading to a lot of pain, certainly in the Ukraine, but not only. So geopolitics is definitely not with us at all. And at the same time, what is very interesting is side by side with the completely unforgivable pain and suffering that has been occasioned on the Ukrainian people, without minimizing that at all. But side by side with that, one of the unintended consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the fact that the world has woken up to the perils of continuing to depend on fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are typically produced and exported by regimes that are not very dependable. Prime example, Russia. And that has been a huge wake-up call that stems from politics, right? But that is having a political economy effect, because the desire now to strengthen energy independence, domestic independence, is stronger than ever. There is not a nation that wants to continue to depend on erratically priced, unpredictable imports of fossil fuels produced by regimes that are irresponsible. And so that has had a very interesting impact, as I say, on the investment into renewables. So just to give you a couple of facts. This year, the IEA, the International Energy Agency, headquartered in Paris, maximum energy authority of the world, has already come out to say that this year, the world will add 440 gigawatts of new renewable capacity. That's a huge jump from last year. And in fact, it's more than double of what was added in 2019. And here's the astonishing fact. It's 24% more than the IEA predicted was going to be added just 6 months ago. Because the investment into renewables is just going completely bonkers. It's going exponential. Few facts on that one. 5 years ago, we invested $1 trillion into fossil fuels and the same into clean energy. It was basically shoulder to shoulder. This year, we're still investing $1 trillion into fossil fuels, but we're investing $1.7 trillion into clean energy. So that means that we have actually turned a corner with energy. And let's remember that energy is the prime producer of greenhouse gases. I actually would love to quote, if I can find it quickly, a recent study from Rocky Mountain Institute that looks at this energy transition. Yeah. So this recent study, and I quote, "At the heart of the energy transition lies the fact that renewable technologies are far superior to fossil fuels. The energy transition is a shift from a concentrated, expensive, polluting, commodity-based system with no learning curve to an efficient, manufactured, technology-driven system that offers continuously falling costs and is available everywhere. It is moving from heavy, fiery molecules to light, obedient electrons, from hunting for fossil fuels to farming the sun." I have never read anything as clear as that, because I would argue, and this, I'm really going to go out on a limb here, I would argue that geopolitics is no longer as necessary as it was way back in 2015, because geopolitics was then really, really critical to set the agreed upon guidelines or guardrails for the decarbonization of the economy. But those have been set. Read the Paris Agreement. Now it's about implementing the Paris Agreement. And yes, if we had all countries as aligned as the United States is now with the IRA, or as aligned as the EU, or as Australia is now with their new government, then of course we would be accelerating, and there's no doubt that we are delayed. There's no doubt that we're delayed. But I would argue that the political economy and the positive characteristics of renewable energy are now so compelling that the market forces are now much more important than the geopolitical forces, and that the market forces are actually already taking electricity generation from renewables, electrification of light vehicles. Certainly, both of those are going exponentially very quickly. And right behind them, we will see the electrification of heavier transport with heavy trucks by land or ships or even aviation. All of that will actually be decarbonized in spaces of time that we would never have imagined 10 years ago. So all of that, the energy sector is going exponential in its decarbonization because it's a better technology and because it gives everyone energy independence. Where we are definitely not on time at all and not going exponential at all is everything to do with nature, everything to do with land use, everything to do with regenerative agriculture, with stopping deforestation, with protecting mangroves. All of that is way behind, way behind. There is no good, compelling business model behind that. There is narrative that is sort of coming out, but it still is a sort of a moral obligation-based narrative that is not a narrative that sits squarely within the market economy, sadly, because economists have still not internalized the externalities that they call into everything that has to do with land use and with nature. And if they ever do, or as soon as they do, that narrative will fundamentally change overnight. But here's a little call to economics to update their profession, please, as soon as possible. But as long as that is so, everything to do with nature is way behind schedule. But the Paris effect that has been written about in several pieces is alive and well in the energy sector.
Yeah. Well, what you say about the change in the step change in the dynamics of this is really interesting, Christiana, actually, and the way you've captured it has made me think afresh about it, actually, because we had, of course, a couple of centuries of countries competing for vice when it came to polluting the planet. We then needed a degree of global cooperation to bring that to an end, and that is what Paris was about. But now we might be in a different mode again, where actually we have countries competing for virtue on this front. In a way, you know, the Inflation Reduction Act and the fact that others are feeling duty bound to do more themselves on this front is a competition for virtue among countries.
Or a competition for protection.
Yeah, and that as well, for security.
You know,
as well.
it's not just a morality thing. It's also a morality thing, virtue, right? But it's also, if it were only a morality thing, I don't know that we would be where we are, right?
You're right.
Think
Virtue and value and security.
Yes.
You're right.
Yes.
All of the above.
Yes, it's both value and values.
Value and values is a great way of capturing it. And actually, you've given me real grounds for optimism on that. I think that change in dynamic is all the difference in the world, because then it will be less reliant on the geopolitics, because the pure forces, if you like, of competition will help bring us home. I want to come to nature, though, because you said that's one where the dynamic hasn't yet changed and the practices haven't yet changed, despite your efforts and indeed, you know, Partha de Gupta's efforts as an economist to change the narrative around nature. Now, it's not a universally bleak story. I turn back to your own country, to Costa Rica, where you've been a global green pioneer. You've turned the corner along a number of fronts. I'd like to ask you, how's that happened? You know, we do have exemplars of progress, and what delivered it in Costa Rica, and what can we learn from that experience in terms of turning the corner elsewhere around the world?
I have a good friend who says anything that is possible in Norway, Israel, or Costa Rica is not necessarily possible anywhere else. Little miracle countries, each very different in doing so, but quite different. Yeah, so Costa Rica's story is really pretty impressive, but it doesn't mean that it's a copy paste. It is unique, and it is very laudable, and it is the story of a country that realized very early on that we had absolutely no value under the ground. We have no metals, we have no mineral resources, we have no precious stones, we have, you know, nothing to dig up. We don't have any fossil fuels, we have nothing to dig up. As many other countries were blessed in 20th century terms, were blessed with a lot of resources underground. And Costa Rica wasn't. We were blessed with many resources above ground. Our biodiversity is our richness, is our wealth. By the way, that's why our name is the Rich Coast, because that's what you see from the coast, is our beautiful greenness. So we were, in terms of energy, we didn't have fossil fuels. We were too poor to import. So we decided, let's use the resource that we have. What is it? Water. And so from the beginning, our electrification in Costa Rica was with hydro. To that, we then later added geothermal because we also have several active volcanoes. And to that, we then added wind when wind energy became commercially available, because we figured out that we have a rainy season and a dry season. In the rainy season, all our reservoirs fill up and we have plenty of hydroelectricity. But in the dry season, our reservoirs go down. And what is Costa Rica's little miracle? In the dry season, there is a lot of wind. So wind and water actually complement each other beautifully as energy sources in Costa Rica, which is why we have both of them in addition to geothermal that serves as our base load. So we have never imported or used fossil fuels for our electricity. We do import fossil fuels for our transport. We are desperately trying to change that, because if it ever makes sense to have electric transport is in a country where all electricity is clean. So that makes extraordinary amount of sense, but we are very far behind on that one, sadly, still. That is with respect to the energy sector. With respect to the land use sector, our agriculture is not one to model in front of any other country. Very, very poor use of land for both cattle and agriculture. So a huge challenge still for us. Where we are a pretty impressive example is what we have done on forest cover. We just 20 years ago, we had 29% of the country under forest cover, and today we have 52%. One of the very, very few countries that have not just halted deforestation, but actually increased forest cover. Why? Because it's in our interest to do so. Yes, of course, you can, put a morality argument to that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The fact is, it's just in our economic interest to do so. We are an eco-tourist destination. Tourism is our #1 income. No one comes to Costa Rica to see any of our cities, because whatever man and woman have made in Costa Rica is not attractive. But what nature has done in Costa Rica is absolutely astonishing. And so people come to Costa Rica to enjoy our national parks. 25% of our territory is in national parks. They come here because of our biodiversity. Between 5 and 6% of the world's biodiversity is in this tiny, tiny little country. We have, and we understand that the more we protect our biodiversity, the more income we're going to have from tourists who come here because they appreciate the biodiversity. So, again, this is value and values. Yes, of course, it's a moral, and we can get on our moral high horse, and can say we, and beat our chest and say we, are protecting our land and da-da-da-da. Honestly, it just makes financial sense. It just makes financial sense. And that's the way it should be, Andy, right? We should everywhere be able to make a business case for protecting and investing and regenerating nature. It should be a business case. It should not be a morality issue. It should not even be a beauty issue, although it is also that. It should not only be a mental health issue. I feel better when I'm walking in the forest or walking on my beach. Yes, all of that is true. But if it doesn't have teeth, if it's not a business compelling case, it's just not going to happen. So again, here's my call to the economists of the world to fix that.
So on that, as an economist, albeit a recovering one, Christiana,
Are you an economist, Andy?
I'm an economist by background.
Okay, well, what can you do with your peers then?
Well, I mean, we're playing catch up. The profession's playing catch up, it's interesting that on both climate through Stern and on nature through Dasgupta,
Yes.
they've turned to economists to redeem their sins of the past, Christiana, and I'm certainly in that camp as well. But in terms of what we can do collectively, not just as economists, what are the avenues for helping us make the business case as compelling as possible? And let me give you one example here, which I recently was reading about with real interest, which is the notion of nature-based markets. So, economists like markets. Ordinarily, we have not had markets in nature, but now there's an embryonic movement towards developing markets in nature. That could be seagrass, that could be peat bogs, that could be kelp fields of various types. Is this a economist misthink? Is this a misuse of markets, or is this a sort of route to redemption for nature and making the business case? Love your views.
Well, I know that this is a very polarizing topic, very contentious, but my position has been clear for years. I am very much on the side and part of the school of thought that believes that we have to attach monetary value to that which we treasure. And that means attach a monetary value to the role of nature. And I am very much of an enthusiast for markets. I sat on the CDM board, if anybody remembers the Clean Development Mechanism way back when. I sat on the CDM board for many years before heading the secretariat. And I am very much of a proponent of carbon markets in both the energy and the nature sector. And I know that there are many countries, especially in Latin America, by the way, that don't agree with that position. But I think that the benefits outweigh the risks. The benefits of being able to inject financing in the short term into the protection of nature, as you say, seaweed, mangroves, reforestation, restoration of degraded soils, on and on and on and on. There's so much that needs to be done. And that if we don't do it, we will actually get to a tipping point beyond which all of this is going to be irrecuperable. So I think that there is a case to be made here of the timing and the urgency of the injection of capital into the restoration and regeneration of nature. If our dear economists had actually done their job, we maybe would need the carbon markets because there would be a clear, compelling business case to do so. But as they come to their collective wisdom in the meantime, because carbon emissions do have a recognized value in the market, to me, it just makes extraordinary amount of sense to use part of that to inject urgent capital into the protection of nature before it is too late. Those who argue to me that no, first we have to reach perfection of decarbonization in the energy sector, and then we will turn our attention to nature. To me, that argument is too dangerous, because it would mean that we wouldn't turn to nature until 20 or 30 years from now. How much nature are we going to have left by then? It is, from my point of view, irresponsible to play with nature that way. So I am very much of a proponent of using market measures, market instruments to inject financing into the protection and regeneration of nature. Having said that, yes, of course, there's a lot of greenwashing going on. There's a lot of, playing games with numbers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is understandable. But the exercise for me should not be throw the baby out with the bathwater, but rather bathe the baby better so that it's a clean baby. Don't throw the baby out. Have integrity, have more integrity, have much better data. Completely possible now with the satellite capacity that we have around the world. It's completely possible to monitor every single square inch of this planet. In fact, it is being monitored. So we don't have to play those games anymore. We don't have to, do greenwashing. It is, from a technical perspective, totally possible to have high integrity in everything that has to do with protection and regeneration of nature. And I think it is urgent. And I'm very saddened by the fact that the cases that have been proven of abuse of those projects actually then annihilated that entire category of offsets, if they're called, for the carbon market.
Well, you've given me now my homework to take away, Christiana, which I will. You're encouraging me to think that when it comes to nature-based markets, that is an avenue that me as an economist and we as a social change organization should give some serious thought to, actually, and quickly. So we will. I'm conscious of the clock, and you've been so generous with your time. So maybe last question from me. Two last questions, actually, thinking about it. One, has the golden toad returned to Monteverde yet? And if not, is it something that could and should happen?
Well, no, it has not returned. I maybe it's because I'm such an elder by now, such an oldie, that I tend to take a long view of things more than I did in the past. And I'm actually interested in the fact that, yes, so many species have become extinct, and there are new species that are developing. There are new species that are developing and becoming a distinct species because they are reacting to the new environmental conditions that we have in places that are either hotter than they used to be, or wetter and more prone to flooding than they used to be, or drier than they used to be. So all of those environmental conditions are actually some of the detonating factors that are leading to the development of new species. Now, let us understand that species develop over millennia, right? So it is not like we're going to have the new species right now. No, but the planet, here's my point, Annabelle. The planet, she has been here for 4.5 billion years without us. We just appeared a second ago. This species, the human species. Now, it's entirely possible, and I have come to terms with this lately in my in my wisdom that comes from old age. It is possible that we as a human race will also disappear as a species. Possible that we will become extinct. What is for sure is that the planet will continue with or without us. And eventually she'll be eaten up by the sun, yes, but in the meantime, she will continue to evolve. And so the way that I think about it, and by the way, that evolution means a whole bunch of more species that we can't even imagine now will develop and will thrive and will populate this planet, with or without us. So what does that actually mean for the moment that we are living here? It does not mean that because the planet will survive us for millions of years, that we should be irresponsible now, right? Oh, well, she's going to be fine, so we can do whatever we want. No, it doesn't mean that. It also doesn't mean that we're indifferent to our presence on this planet. Quite to the contrary, it means that we have a shared common responsibility to act out of our highest self while we're here. Understanding that we're here and passing each of one of us individually, but that each one of us leaves a legacy for future generations. And that means that we have a huge individual and collective responsibility to do the utmost that we can for the stability of our home, our planet home, and to ensure that those that come after us have a really good chance of doing, again, better for future generations. Not that we're guaranteeing at all that we're going to solve climate change, Andy. Let's be really clear about that. I don't believe we will ever solve climate change. We're too late for that. We're going to have to manage climate change. Not that we're guaranteeing that humans will forever be on this planet. Probably not. Or maybe not. That's not the point. The point is, who are we today? Where do I put my thought, my word, and my action today? For what purpose and with what impact? That's the important question, irrespective of where we're going to go in a million years.
Wonderful. And this is definitely my last question, so we don't get any more of your time. And it follows from that, I think, I hope very nicely, which is you're an optimist. And what's come across today loud and clear is how much of an optimist you are, as the person who set up, I think, the Global Optimism Group, and of course through the podcast, Outrage and Optimism. You're an optimist to your core, Christiana. And I want you to maybe finish by giving us some optimism. Where should we look at a time when, there are lots of things in the world that are not going as we would wish? What are the grounds for optimism? Where should we look for inspiration to take us to a better place, whether that's of people or of places or of planet?
Well, a lot. There's a lot. First, let's look at history and recognize that actually, despite the fact, that we have all this bad news, despite that, we're actually in a much better place today than we were yesterday with respect to childbirth, infancy health, women's rights, education in general, but especially for girls and women, positions of power for women, even deaths because of war. Yes, we are living this horrible war right now, but when you compare deaths by war with history, we're doing much better now. On and on and on and on. So there are, there's just ample data that shows that we have improved as a society. Poverty, that's the one that gets me most. We have definitely brought out, China particularly, kudos to them, have definitely brought out millions of people out of poverty. So first, let's look at history. Secondly, let's jump over the present for the time being. Let's look at the future of what is possible, right? And I've just painted a picture for you of a world that can be so much better because we have the capacity to have let's say, cities that are not built out of cement and roads and bridges, but actually organically grown, where there is so much more local production of fruits, vegetables, where there is water capture, where there is much more greenery in cities, where there are less cars because we have much better transport, shared transport, intelligent transport, where pavements have been transformed into gardens, where rooftops are gardens, where walls are solar energy capturing and producing walls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So cities can become so much more human friendly, and all the technologies are there. Land use, the technologies are there to improve and have sustainable agriculture so that we do not have to have any more famine on this world. We produce enough food for everyone to eat. We just don't distribute it rightly, but we can produce healthy food and distribute it rightly and produce it where it is more needed as opposed to long transport, so that there's no need for any famine in this world. Oceans, we're just beginning to understand what the oceans can provide for us. Recently, seaweed being made into containers so that you can, this is a really cool company, Andy, and Prince William was just at this company, which is why, and it's a part of the Earthshot, which is why it's on my mind. So NOPLA in the UK, this is probably not for the article, but just to give you a sense, NOPLA it comes from not plastic, and in the UK, what they do is they take seaweed and they create out of seaweed, they can create, like, for example, little skins that contain liquid. So you can put water, you can put juice, you can put medicines, whatever. And instead of picking up a glass of liquid, you just put this into your mouth and it just disappears. They're creating all kinds of containers for solid food, et cetera, et cetera. So through seaweed. And completely digestible, degradable, etc. So just a tiny little example of how we are just beginning to understand what the oceans, if we liberate them from plastics and from pollution, could actually do for a more integrated humanity and nature future. So the future is incredibly promising. I take optimism from that as well. I take optimism from the past. I take optimism from the future. I hope that I have no idea. I could, pass on this afternoon, but I hope that I will live long enough to see some of these amazing things that are currently still projects and pilot projects become mainstream, because the future that we want and the future that we choose is so much better than the present that we have. So I take optimism from that. But I also take optimism from the present, Andy, because I've just given you, some data on what we're already doing on energy. What the young people are doing, the millions of people who are in the streets and calling us to account, holding us to account, because they understand that this is about their life, is so moving to me. So moving to me and so inspiring, because they're right. They're right. And the fact that they're willing to take the time to go and demonstrate on the streets, I think, is completely brilliant. It is not their responsibility to solve this problem, by the way. I don't agree with those who say, thank God for future generations, they're going to solve the problem. No, by the time those kids are at the decision table, it's going to be too late. So I am not exempting my generation from solving this, but I am saying it is fantastic that we're being pressed by young people today. And the fact that we have so many entrepreneurs that are investing today into those technologies of tomorrow is also a deep well of optimism.
What a magnificent tour de force and tour d'horizon. Thank you so much. It's been absolute education as ever, and a treat for us listen and learn from you, Christiana. That's been wonderful. Thank you. I couldn't thank you enough.
No, thank you, Andy. Thank you for the invitation to participate there. Really appreciate it.